if the UK decides to leave the European Union, it's going to probably have a significant domino effect.
Frank, on Thursday, the UK will decide if they're in or out of the EU. A recent poll showed that if the UK could keep a free trade agreement with EU members, the population would vote to leave. So my question is to you, should the UK fear losing a free trade agreement with the EU?
Well, it's true that the UK government and quasi-government agencies like the IMF and OECD have been, issuing continuous warnings that Brexit would cause a significant drop in trade and GDP. For me, I think that the reality is that the impact of Brexit has been grossly exaggerated. We have to understand that in today's world, a product has parts coming from all over the world. A BMW is only called German because of historical association. In reality, the steel in a BMW may come from Brazil or China, the upholstery from the UK, the engine from France, and the electronics from the USA. Also, labor costs are only 10% of a car, and some of it may even be foreign labor. Okay. Also, profits are distributed to BMW shareholders and bondholders, which are more likely to be a hedge fund in Tokyo than, for example, a mechanic in Dusseldorf. Okay. The world is massively economically integrated. Relative free trade and free movement of capital is no longer an option for most countries, whether it's the UK or any of the other countries in the EU. In other words, this boat has left years ago. So despite, French threat of a bloody Brexit, Germany, which runs its second largest bilateral trade surplus with the UK, has very little interest in starting a trade war, nor do some of the private interests, for example, BMW, Mercedes, Audi, that sell a lot of cars in the UK, or, the high-end French winemakers, from Bordeaux, who also sell a lot of wines to the UK. They have very little interest in, seeing tariffs go up either in the UK or in Europe. We also must remember that we already have relatively low, according to the WTO, we already have very low tariffs on most goods that are traded between developed economies.
Okay, so my second question is, another poll showed that the Leave and Remain campaign are very close, neck and neck, in fact. So we know what the advantages are of staying in the EU. What are the disadvantages of staying in the EU?
Well, we have to remember that the EU was created to increase freedoms. In other words, it was created to increase the freedom of the movement of goods, the movement of capital, and the movement of people. And as expected, it's basically evolved into an entity that actually restricts freedoms. For example, we have an enormous amount of rules and regulations that have been imposed by basically the European Commission, which, by the way, is an unelected body. For example, we have 31 rules on toothbrushes, 47 rules on toothpaste. We have over 400 rules on towels, 1,246 rules on bread, and over 12,000 rules on milk. Milk is really quite dangerous. And basically what's been happening is that it's benefiting the large crony capitalist firms, at the expense of the small and medium-sized enterprises, because those small and medium-sized enterprises do not have the resources, the legal resources, to be able to jump through every EU hoop that the EU puts up to basically bring a product to market. Also, we have to realize that there are thousands and thousands of lobbyists in Brussels, and these lobbyists are being paid by the big firms. So what EU has done is basically it's limited competition in the European region.
So, Dr. Frank, my final question is, if the UK does leave the EU, what should we expect?
When the EU was created, it allowed for countries to leave the EU. This is called Article 50. So by the time the UK applied under Article 50 and it got implemented, we're talking probably 2020. Okay. The important thing, though, is to realize is that if the UK decides to leave the European Union, it's going to probably have a significant domino effect. In other words, it's likely that Italy and possibly France, and in the end, maybe Germany, we want to leave. We have to remember that the UK contributes a lot to the EU budget. Okay, it contributes about 136 million pounds per week, and historically, it's paid more into the EU than it's gotten from the EU. Okay, so other countries such as France, Italy, and Spain are going to have a hard time, finding the funds, given the fact that they already have debt to GDP ratios over 100%. Now, Germany, all of a sudden, is going to find that its contribution ratio has gone up. Okay, and it's going to be, it's going to be in a position where it may actually have to pick up some of the other countries' tab. Okay, although in theory Greece is supposedly paying part of the EU budget, everyone knows that it's being able to pay this money because Germany is really covering it through loans that Greece has obtained through the EU. We have to remember that Germany already envies Britain's decision not to join the monetary union. It laments losing monetary control of its currency. If Brexit is successful, Germany will find the option of regaining control over its monetary and regulatory policy seductive. We may be shortly talking about Gexit. Okay, German exit. Okay, yet without Germany, the EU really would be a non-entity. Okay, and that's a likely occurrence if the UK was actually to vote to leave the European Union.
Thank you, Dr. Frank, for joining us in our studio via video call. It's been a pleasure.
Well, it's always a pleasure doing an interview with Dukascopy TV.
That wraps up today's interview, but don't forget you can download our app or follow us on Facebook. Goodbye for now.